I'm executive director of the Dubnov Institute for Israel Studies. Welcome to our final lecture of the semester and a Hanukkah party following right upstairs on the fourth floor after this at 5 o'clock. I'm very happy to introduce my friend Arie Dubnov, who's the still fairly new Mexican professor of the Israel Studies at George Washington University. I knew Max Tickton, I'm sure many of you did as well, a noted scholar of Jewish history and literature who taught there many years. Arie does both Jewish and Israeli history. He'll be talking about his new book, Partition, which shows the partitions that we tend to think of Palestine especially. There's also Northern Ireland, and there's India and others. So he'll be looking at it in a transnational context. So Arie Dubnov, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And really, thank you, Paul, both for the introduction and for inviting me here and Address. And I know that a lot of organizing these events is always a big logistical undertaking. So I thank you all, and thank you all for coming. And I was about to start my talk with a pun about me being the human barrier partitioning you from the latkes afterwards, but we already started the lecture with opening in different partitions, so I'm extremely lucky to have such a big crowd here today. So I will jump right in, and as you can see, I already using this opportunity to, again, my soon-to-be published, officially it will be published only in January, collection of essays on partition. Now, the recent years witness a public and scholarly interest in the history and in particular the memory of partition. Our understanding of partitions in a transnational global context is still lacking to a great degree, and the division of territorial units into religious, sectarian, ethno-national lines was seen in different lights. But part of the reason, the collection argued that part of the reason we tended not to look at them in a comparative perspective has also to do with the fact that often in the classic cases of partition in the post-World War II world, partition was seen as sort of the step towards independence, or if you'd like, even the dark side of independence. So there was a tendency to look to write teleological narratives about the creation of a nation state, but at the same time, in the three paradigmatic cases that I would like to put side by side, first the case of Ireland in 1922, then in Palestine in two cases actually, and we'll talk about 1937 and then 47, and later on, lastly, in the Indian subcontinent in 1947, partition was depicted as an unavoidable step towards an acquisition of sovereignty, and it was something that you have to make sort of a painful surgery, without which you will not create these new political entities, namely the Irish Free State, a euphemism in many respects, and I'll mention why I call it sort of a bit of a euphemism, the republics of India and Pakistan, and of course the state of Israel. Now, of course, what these partitions have in common, as the genesis goes, is of course the British Empire, right? Technically, Palestine in 1947 was partitioned by the United Nations. You're absolutely right, but the genesis of the ideas emerged from the British mandatory context. and also, of course, the proximity between the moment of independence and the practice of partition. But what is not less important for me is that in all three cases you see something that is a bit of a divorce from the way we usually tell the stories of both independence and partition. Because more than lines drawn or on maps, what you see in all these cases is that partition was first accepted as a principle. And what we assume is partition, we imagine a map and someone is cutting it into two, is actually the last phase in this partition. I would call upon us to think about partition as a package deal that includes several things. The redrawing of international maps is actually the last thing. And historiography actually, it will be, of course, inaccurate to say that historians did not study partition. But partition as a subject was left primarily to diplomatic and imperial historians. From a very early stage, most of the imperial history was written from a very unapologetical metropolitan perspective. It privileged high politics. It tended to see partition as a result of technical rearrangement. That's something that was when that boundary commissions and faithless clerks were assigned to that ungrateful task. Often these were noble-minded but awfully, shockingly naive British administrators. But actually to understand the violence that turning the theory into a practice brought with it, you have to look at the uncivilized natives that are turning it turning it into a volcano. If you'd like, this is also something that you can find outside the professional scholarly literature. If you like, the famous poem by W.H. Auden summarizes this. It's a famous poem that Auden wrote about Cyril Radcliffe's arrival to India to draw the famous line that would become the international border between Pakistan and Israel, and in India. It captured this spirit extremely well. Unbiased, at least, he was when he arrived on his mission, having never set eyes on the land that he was called to partition, having between two peoples fanatically at odds, with their different diets and incompatible gods. More comical, less dramatic take, but nevertheless a take that his basic message is quite similar. It can be found in one of the early comedies of Peter Sellers. It's a not very well-known comedy, but I would recommend watching it. Carlton Brown of the FO. FO is, of course, the Foreign Office, and it presents this Solomonic trial as a result of something that was imposed in a top-down manner by British Foreign Office men trying to get rid of antique colonial possessions in a very cynical way. Once the empire was no longer an asset, it became a liability, and trying to fit itself to the new Cold War realities. And these type of memories were at odds, of course, with the local histories that were written by nationalist histories that were seeing partition in a different light, or sidelining it to focus on the moment of independence. Part of what changed, especially as post-colonial theory emerged, but also when in the 1980s and 90s people put more attention to the questions of memory and history, is that one of the assumptions about partition, that partition was an event that was closed, that it was maybe a painful event, maybe a climatic event, but it was an event that was put to an end, was actually challenged by the politics of these new polities. Partition was not seen as a resolved question, neither in the Indian subcontinent. Anyone that knows how the partition evolved itself. East Pakistan becomes a different country. The questions of Kashmir, the northern Irish border that is still at the head, came back to the headlines today in the context of Brexit. And especially in the Indian case, for instance, in the mid-1980s, a violent wave, a wave of violence that crossed the country, that emerged in the context of Indira Gandhi's assassination, really brought it to attention that partition is still here and its ghost are present. So it was suddenly seen as an ongoing process of an unfinished business. So this can explain, for instance, why suddenly you see far more attention that was given to a history that is no longer written in a top-down manner from the London metropolitan perspective, but regional history and also a history that is much more invested on the social and the oral history dimension. In very impressive projects such as in the Indian case, the 1947 archive, collecting vast testimonies of people who experienced it is part of it. So I'm not here to argue that the scholarship did not evolve, it changed over time, but what happened actually in these processes is further and further fragmentization. You can see we know much more about these partitions in a regional context, but exactly what was even compromised furthermore was that global international perspective. So contemporary historiography, of course, in a way, I would argue, is missing this synoptic view of the partitions, and partitions in the plural, one that would allow us to see their shared context and genealogy the way they emerge, and also to understand how they shaped these post-colonial polities, and how what do we understand by putting them on the same framework. And just don't want to spend too much time on methodology here. I'll be happy to elaborate on this at the Q&A session, but this is a narcissism of minor differences. It's very important for me as a scholar not to say that what I'm doing is comparative history or comparative partitions. I'm not just putting these partitions side by side and see the similarities. This is something that political scientists did many times. I am trying to understand how can we see them as part of one shared story and to see the connections. And connections are seen in various ways. At the level of the imperial mindset, so to speak, if there's such a thing, to see whether we actually had cases in which ideas of partition were duplicated in different cases. Do we see fingerprints of some imperial thinkers that were involved or were looking at a partition in one case and then trying to copy-paste it to a different circumstances? But partition is one of a story of a bigger framework, also in a different level. When you see the nationalist leaders looking at what the future beholds for them, they are often involved in what I would sometimes call an analogical imagination. They understand that what's happening in other parts of the empire might very quickly come and will shape their future as well. So these are my general comments, but these prefatory comments are here to say that part of what I'm trying to offer in the next few minutes is a way to think about partition as a so-called traveling theory. The term traveling theory was not coined by me. I'm plagiarizing it from Edward Said, but in a different way. And as you can understand, maybe I'm coming to this project equipped with the toolkit of an intellectual historian. And part of the, and the specific test case I will be talking about will try to show how you can think about it in a comparative, in a transnational perspective by following the trajectory of one individual. For me, is a key individual. So I will be focusing here in the next few minutes on the specific chapter I contributed to my own collection, but I think that I hope encapsulates the bigger some of the bigger arguments of the project itself. So who is the individual? You can see his portrait before you. Sir Reginald Copeland, fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, the second Baker Professor of Colonial History at Oxford University. Now it's renamed Imperial History, and a long-standing contributor and editor to a very important journal, the Roundtable Journal, which exists to this day, which was, if you like, the think tank, the organ of the key group of neo-imperial thinkers that are thinking about the way to redesign the empire after World War I. Its origins even begin before, and someone that directly and indirectly was involved in all of the three partitions I've just mentioned. First, he worked very closely with Lionel G. Curtis, the uncrowned leader of the Roundtable Group, and the mastermind of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, who served as the special advisor to the Colonial Secretary on Irish Affairs from October 1924. And thanks to these contacts, Copeland, still a young man at the early stages of his career, was able to see, albeit from distance, the creation of the Irish Free State and the carving out of a separate North Irish entity. And the map here, and especially if you see the map next to the date, already alludes to one of the arguments I've made earlier. The Irish partition as a principle, as an arranging idea for to solve the Irish problem was accepted in 1922. It will take a considerable delay, almost 4 years, and a civil war until the commission would actually determine what the border is, and I'll talk about it later on. Next, in summer 1936, and here we come to the topic that I assume attracted most of us to the room, Copeland was appointed member of Lord Pill's Commission of Inquiry that was sent to Palestine famously to look into the reasons of what the British was calling then the disturbances, later named as the Great Arab Revolt. You can see him in this caricature that appeared in the very end of the table on the right corner. And this is, of course, the commission that in July 1937 published the document that recommended creating two separate federal states for Jews and Arabs, with Britain still holding key components of the land, and I will talk about these details. For many years, historians debated who is the main architect of these ideas. In recent years, especially thanks to the work of Penny Sinangu, that really went through so many of the drafts, one could really see that in many respects, Copeland is the alpha male in the room. He's the one that pushed the committee more than anyone else to accept the partition as he imagined it. And next, in 1942, Copeland finds himself in India. He made himself the leading expert on Indian politics even earlier on, and during World War II, he joined Stafford Cripps in his special cabinet mission to India in 1942. It's a very important chapter in the history of the Indian struggle for independence, but he failed. This is a cabinet mission that failed miserably in persuading Gandhi and Nehru to accept on themselves something that is a bit less than independence, dominion status. And this is an interesting element because 10 years earlier, Gandhi was begging to get that the British will allow him to become a citizen, not of an independent sovereign state, but a citizen of the British Commonwealth of Nations, who was trying to rescue himself from a status of a subject and turn into a citizen, but a citizen of the empire. At the time of World War II, the British were willing to take these ideas seriously, but by this time, the movement was already moved on. Famously, the Indians rejected this offer as a check that is coming from a bank that already bankrupted. But this is how they famously called it. And Copeland, of course, will return as a good professor to his college at Oxford and will author a magisterial trilogy on Indian politics. The structure of this trilogy resembles tremendously well the Peel Commission report that is also subdivided into 3 parts: historical background, analysis of the present, and recommendations about the future. Very similar style that was written in the context of serious engagement with the idea of partition in India. So if you would like, Copeland serves here as the astonishing connecteur, or if you like, the ultimate imperial Waldo. He reappears suddenly when you have these messes and search for him in the background, blending in the crowds, but for some reason appears time and again. And if you like, Copeland was not simply someone that found himself by coincidence in all these cases. It is related to the way Copeland thought about politics and history. Copeland was an unapologetic mouthpiece of a neo-imperial group of thinkers that were thinking about the way in which the British Empire needs to rearrange itself. And this group was talking very clearly about partition, not as an exit strategy. So partition, as it was devised by people like Copeland in the 1920s and 30s, was not about an empire that is declining and collapsing fast and you're creating new nation states. It was, if you like, the exact opposite. This is the ultimate story of unintended consequences. This was a method of containment, so to speak, of national antagonism within an empire that these thinkers were imagining as some sort of a network of city-states that will govern themselves. It's not a coincidence that Copeland, like so many of these imperial thinkers, came with a very strong Oxonian classicist background. Often they were thinking about the empire and in analogy not to Rome, God forbid, this is the empire that collapsed, but to Athens and the Athenian League. And the idea that you will have a common civilization of Hellenic nations, but each one will run its own business through separate city-states. But when the Persians are attacking, we'll all unite. This is a crude simplification of the way the Round Table group was thinking about the new empire that Lionel Curtis was starting to imagine using a very important word, Commonwealth, not as a separate Commonwealth, but the British Commonwealth of Nations. And Hugh Egerton, who was the first Bates professor of colonial history that Copeland will succeed as the second chair, was imagining as actually the driving engine behind colonial history of the British Empire. And even other members, the lesser known members of the Round Table group, were thinking about it through a clear federalist language. And one of the fascinating, though it's surprising to see how almost entirely forgotten figure he is, a Scot named Frederick Scott Oliver, who was maybe today, given the popularity of Hamilton as a Broadway show, we will return to him, wrote the first biography of Hamilton in Britain. And that was a bestseller then. And the thinking about federalism and about also how to prevent the Great Schism of the 13 colonies was one of the leading engines of their thought. And in a sense, it's very interesting to have such a talk in a place like Washington, because if you want to understand how this group of thinkers are imagining the future of the empire, much of it has to do with thinking about the bad case of 1776 with the 13 colonies, but also to think about the successful attempt. And the successful attempt will be our northern neighbor, Canada, the first Dominion. So Canada, suddenly you have a very interesting both political and intellectual and historical effort to understand the origins of modern Canada and how first Dominion was created, because after World War I, dominionization, creating communities that are autonomous and are self-governing themselves under the British flag, will be one of the main ways in which they are thinking about the creation of the new empire. Now, for instance, the historians among us will appreciate this, because part of what we have here is the age in which there was a very small gap between the historian and the policymaker, or if you like, it was an age in which the British elite had still much respect to the academic, and the academic was often a whisperer to the politician. And people like Egerton, the inaugural big professor of colonial history at Oxford, when he was thinking about federations in his magisterial 1911 historical surveys, federations and union within the British Empire, it was actually producing not only historical analysis but also the language that later on political theory will be using. He was always using organic and not mechanical metaphors. It is a process of evolution and not revolution. And federalism for him was an expression of desire for union, but not desire for unity. The popular phrase would be always the diversity within unity. And this arrangement rested on a historical narrative that distinguished very sharply between 1776 in North America as the colossal failure to unionize North America, and Lord Durham's famous 1839 report on Canada that was hailed as a liberal balance between modified form of local self-government and legislative union. This was the key report that prepared the ground for the Dominion of Canada. So, but ironically, it would be in Britain's Irish backyard and not in the distant overseas colonies that these lofty visions would had to be implemented. And again, I don't want to spend too much time now on this. Part of the problem, or part of the challenge in reading Partition in such a way, is the fact that the historiography, the British historiography at least, demarcated very different realms to anyone who does Irish history. Ireland is seen as not part of imperial history. Imperial history is only overseas colonies, and one needs to sort of create a intellectual bridge to understand that some of the debates that you can see in Ireland are key here. So I don't want to go into details about the history of the Irish partition, but few key details are important. Of course, it has short-term reasons, but also long-term reasons. Debates about the home rule of Ireland predate the 20th century, and this is an ongoing question. World War I plays a significant role because the Irish understand that when the British are weak, it's more likely to push them to make concessions that they won't do in other cases. But it's also a violent process. No, I assume I don't need to introduce you to the Easter Rising in 1916 and the brutal way in which it was put down. But what is interesting about the way the Roundtable group, Lionel Curtis and others, are thinking about the partition is that it's not only about dividing the northern territories, of course, the Protestant territories from the southern state. It's also that the free Irish state, and I'm always using my hands for a quotation mark, is not a sovereign nation state the way we imagine states. It's actually a dominion under the British flag. So it's self-government of the south as separated from the north, which is Britain per se. So declaring Ireland independent in that respect it opens up the room for some sort of anachronism for us, that we assume that the way they thought about independence is similar to us. De facto, it meant that it gained status of a dominion still contained within the empire, following the trajectory of Canada, the first dominion, and, of course, other new dominions, one of which is most important in our respect is South Africa, which is, again, part of the dynamic. I will jump through it. Now, the application of the territorial partition in Ireland, it was often argued, provided a model of sorts for Palestine and later on for India. Yet Ireland failed to serve as the viable precedent in at least two critical senses. First, while the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 granted dominion status to those 26 countries of Northern Ireland, the colonial administrators were very reluctant not to declare Palestine a dominion in the same way, and the formula was seen as inapplicable in the setting of a Yishuv versus local Arab population. Secondly, it was the mandatory circumstances are radically different. Britain cannot do whatever it wants. It's not British territory. It's constrained by Geneva, and the League of Nations has a say. So it has a more limited maneuvering space. So part of what you will see in people like Copeland appears here in the photo. He's the second from the left, looking as a good visionary into the future, is that he's trying to even redefine in his writing how to understand the term mandate to allow this to happen. But a critical third difference is important to add to our picture, and this is the fact that the partition of Palestine is already what I would call a post-Lausanne partition. And what do I mean by post-Lausanne? 1923, the Irish-Turkish conflict is resolved, quote unquote, through massive transfers of both Greek and Turkish population, and the League of Nations endorses it. Part of what is lacking from the 1922 Irish case, but appears both in Palestine in 1937, then reappears in 1947 in India and in Palestine, is of course that partition is already part of that package deal that includes not only carving out of separate states through creating of a border, it's not only about creating new entities that are called states, it's also about creating states that have clear demographic dominance through the method of exchange of population that was seen in the 1920s as a kosher, liberal way of unmixing populations once it got the endorsement from the League of Nations. That may sound odd to us today. Now, there's no doubt that in the critical, if it's okay, I'll take questions at the end. Thanks. There were critical months in which Copeland stayed in Palestine, and these were also a fertile ground to both quasi-myth, sometimes even conspiracy theories. While most of the members of the delegation stayed in Jerusalem, Copeland toured the land, and he was very close and negotiated quasi-secretly with Chaim Weizmann. And it was a famous, or if you like, infamous case in which Chaim Weizmann invited Copeland to visit Nahalal in the northern part of today's Israel. That was kind of the model moshav that often the Zionists will showcase to friends. And it was a rainy day, as if someone like Copeland that's coming from England is so intimidated by rain. So Weizmann used it as an excuse. Let's go into this room and we'll speak about we'll talk quietly. And they were closed in that room, allowing no one to get in for hours. The only record we have from that famous meeting is this photo that is basically a paparazzi photo. One of the members of Nahalal took a photo, and you can even see Weizmann pushing him off. No, 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 this is the room for us. And some historians we will, all of us would really would like to be the fly on the wall in that room to know exactly what Weizmann said to Copeland in those critical weeks before the final partition proposal was put on the table. So I don't want to go into that debate in to a great degree, because whether an argument that was made by some historians, including Moti Golani, is that partition was something that Weizmann was craving for, but he understood it would be easier for him to deliver the deal if it will appear as if it was offered from above, from London and not else. What I would like to turn your attention to, and this is the only excuse to reproduce this photo, is what is lacking here. Maybe they were talking about partition. Probably they were, but they don't have maps. It's not about putting maps on the table and trying to draw the lines. So part of what they were talking about is exactly accepting partition as a principle, including the partition, the exchange of populations that comes with it. Now, if we remember that partition is a package deal, this will allow us to understand why it created such a controversy, not only between Jews and Arabs, but also within the Zionist camp. So often it is forgotten that one of the most vocal critics of partition was no other than Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of revisionist Zionists, seen as the most hawkish militarist Zionist. He is the one that is writing immediately against the partition. This was only one pamphlet in a series of pamphlets against ha-Chalukah, neged ha-Chalukah. And it's interesting to see how he's thinking about partition and how he explains why he rejects it. And Jabotinsky is saying very quickly on that the future of Palestine is in the hands of some sort of a collaboration with Britain. In 1927, Jabotinsky will be the first one to endorse enthusiastically a proposal to call Palestine the seventh dominion of the British Commonwealth of Nations. It becomes an official part of his party platform, and he will create a league for the Palestine Dominion that will work in collaboration with the twin league in London. So it's not about simply hating the British. The British have a very ambivalent relationship with the Zionist cause in Jabotinsky's case, and also the fact that I reproduced one of the numerous photos in which Jabotinsky is always photographed in the uniform of Beitar, but these are also uniform of the British Army. So part of what part of my argument is that if you want to understand Jabotinsky in those years, he is casting himself vis-a-vis the British Empire as a potential Jewish Gurkha, a brave soldier helping the empire to save its interests east of Suez, to protect the port in Haifa, and it's not about an anti-colonial revolt as the heirs and the followers of Jabotinsky will carry out in the context of World War II and the immediate aftermath of World War II. So revisionist Zionism itself changes its position very radically. But part of what is also important here is to understand that Jabotinsky, as a Central European Jew coming from Odessa, and knowing that the beating heart and the modern is still, we are talking about a pre-Holocaust European Jewry, and he sets his eyes specifically on most on Polish Jews. He understands that the consequences of accepting the idea of partition in Palestine will be devastating when the same principle will be applied on Jews in Poland. And this is an explicit, it's not a subtext of his argument, it's explicitly part of the arguments he's bringing forth to the table. A short quote, that's my my translation, poor translation, I'm afraid. The chatter, here we mean the chatter in the Peel report. The chatter regarding the transfer of Arabs is even more irresponsible. From a Jewish point of view, it is nothing short of a crime. While the Royal Commission babbles of instructive precedent, that is the expulsion of more than 1 million Greeks from Turkey, we witness one of the cases in which it toys with concepts that none of its members had any idea about. And he explicitly says, if you are accepting this, you are, will have devastating application on Jews in Europe as well. So this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, that the partition in 1937 is shelved for a long time and is not endorsed enthusiastically. And when it will be brought back from the storage room 10 years later, the circumstances are radically different. The empire is quickly breaking down. Partition is now offered to as something that is coming through the UNSCOP commission that was assigned in 1947, once the British already declaring that they're leaving Palestine. And it will be interesting to see that in that decade, our hero Copeland is actually is launching a campaign to resuscitate this partition plan for many cases, calling it the only possible solution to a demographically unbalanced condition. Now, I'm reaching the last part of my lecture, and so do we see here simply a mechanical copy-paste of a British colonial thinker? Do we see, therefore, Copeland in his third phase moving to the Indian subcontinent, thinking about the future of the Raj exactly the same way? So, as much as I don't want to let our British administrators off the hook, they're slightly more sophisticated than that. You will be surprised to see that when Copeland is writing about India, so much of his effort is to show how the same idea of partition that is applicable in Palestine is actually a very bad proposal for the future of the Indian subcontinent. Actually, in the case of India, he's coming with a very different opinion. He has very strong opinions about how partition is actually inapplicable in a place like the Punjab. I don't want to go. I won't read this entire quote. I'll just focus on the part that is highlighted with a different color in the middle, but it is not be supposed that the minority problem in India could be eased by this method to anything like the same extent as it made in all small European countries. The vast scales, the intermixing of populations, the fact that minority question that we think about in the European context doesn't work here. So actually Copeland is devising a different method that goes back to his federalist scheme. He imagines the future of the Indian subcontinent through redistricting that will create 7 different regions and that will create one big federal unity. Now, why am I mentioning these plans? These are one of the many plans that were thrown to the garbage bin of history. Because actually, from Copeland's point of view, he is very consistent. He's still thinking about a federalist schema that will allow you to contain differences and avoid partition as it happened to be understood in a post-World War II context as creation of sovereign nation state with an international border. And actually, if you understand this, you understand several things. A, by this stage, partition has a life of its own. The architects, or even if he's the architect or the originator, he's no longer able to convince the actors on the ground to follow his advices. So his recommendations from World War II and the immediate post-World War are exactly the type of recommendations that are pushed aside. So by the local actors. Secondly, I've mentioned analogical imagination. It's amazing, even before the age of Twitter, how much the memory span of people was short. Zionists in 1947 suddenly look at what's happening in India and are saying to themselves, oh, goodness, the thing that the British are doing in India will soon come to us, without even understanding that it's only a 10-year trajectory, that the origins of the idea. So one example is a memo that was produced by Jacob Robinson, was the director of the Institute of Jewish Affairs in New York and professor of international law at Columbia University, that is playing a very central role at the UN in November 1947. He produces a confidential memo that describes in great detail what exactly the British are trying to do in India. It's a very accurate detail, but it's amazing to see how much it's difficult for him to see the connection between the earlier programs. And this also leads me to the last point, that Copeland continues defending his idea of partition, but he clarifies that this is a federalist type of eschatology. What do I mean by that? This is an excerpt from a letter published at the London Times in July 1946. And listen to the type of rhetoric he's using and the type of allusions. The Peel Commission is defending the partition of 1937 9 years later, did their best to combat the evasive, comforting belief in the possibility of an Arab-Jewish reconciliation in an undivided Palestine, because they regard it as the greatest and the most persistent obstacle to a real and durable settlement. And here comes the crucial part of Copeland's, if you like, speaking about himself in the third person. 10 years ago, the writer, i.e. Copeland, had lively talk with a passionate anti-Jewish Arab patriot in Palestine. Tear us apart, he said, and then we may learn in time to come together again. Now, this type of eschatology is actually the driving force behind Copeland's ideas. Partition is the road towards self-government that will then lead to a federal unity. This is a classic case of an unintended consequences as far as Copeland is concerned. Partition will take place in a different way. Actually, the way he imagines the future of these regions goes back to his British background. The last book he will publish, that will publish posthumously, the last book he was writing close to his death, is actually a book about British history, and also using Britain as the example for the future. Not only because it's liberal, not only because it has a parliament, but also because it was able to go beyond the division between the Welsh and the Scots and the English and create this amazing unity. And this is a clear connection, and he makes a clear connection with the way he thinks about partition. So this is briefly my argument. The way in which he praised the Welshmen and the Scotchmen that were far too level-headed to contemplate a Welsh or Scottish Pakistan is the key argument. So intellectual history was used by me here not as a tool to show that the intellectuals are architects that are able to shape the political environment in an absolute way. It was my way to offer you a way to think about partition as a traveling theory, but also ideas, this is a quote I like using from Karl Popper, are a bit like our children. We bring them to the world, but then they go out and make the mess by themselves. So maybe this is part of the dynamic we need to understand. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to
Thanks very much, Arie. You've given a lot of food for thought. Are there questions that people would like to ask, or I'll start with...
There was one student in the bathroom that was very patient.
You mentioned something about a closed... I don't know what word that was.
Lausanne.
Lausanne.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I kind of missed
Sure.
it.
Of
And
course,
I don't know how to spell it.
So Lausanne is the name of the city in Switzerland where the agreement was signed. But Lausanne agreement or the Lausanne Treaty is the name that is often used to refer to the League of Nations calling for the exchange of Greek population from the territory of modern Turkey and vice versa, and making it as part of the solution to the Greco-Turkish War. That was a very big conflict that started already at the minute World War I ended. We assumed that hostilities and violence ended. Actually, so many of these areas are bloody. So that was seen as a solution. The scholarship today, the historians today, are looking in a new light at these type of agreements. There's a wonderful book, if you're interested, by Umut Özü, Turkish name, that is called Formalizing Displacement, that can give you a really good account of what's happening there, and also the legal, the legal mechanisms and the language that was developed to turn it something that was already an expulsion in process. So it's not as if people were just fighting conventional warfare without expulsion and were waiting for the League of Nations to give them the solution. Expulsions were taking place de facto on the ground, and then the League of Nations says, you know what, this is actually the way to go. And unmixing of population is the only method to solve these bloody conflicts.
Thank you.
Peter?
So, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I have a question about consistency
Mm.
in British policy, because I mean, you give a number of examples where these same principles are applied, but you could also point to counterexamples. You know, why don't the Kurds get their partition? You know, why is it that in the case of Iraq, the British are fighting fragmentation so hard?
Right.
Trying to put a lid over everything. Where so it happens in one place, it doesn't happen in the other place. I mean, is it more of a model of a British policy that is arbitrary in many ways and very focused on the particular place that you're looking at, or is there consistency in that regard?
That's a great question. Thank you for this. I mean, this is, you know, I'm always cautious not to follow the footsteps of Shimon Peres and say yes and no. But I will say two key comments here. British imperial historians will always find the easy exit strategy of saying, there's no one big British establishment with the capital E, and you have fraught relationship between the colonial office and the foreign office. They're not thinking the same way, and definitely when you come to institutional politics, you definitely see this. Two other things that can explain this inconsistency is also the way in which civilizational language was used in different ways. So part of and I've left it a bit as the subject of this lecture, because it's not the focus of partition. It's part of the political thinking after World War I of those British neo-imperial thinkers is our rules and methods of governance that we apply on more civilized groups applicable in other parts of the world. Now, it applies to so many weird things that are happening in the post-Wilsonian world, right? So it's like the famous case that Jan Smuts says, why won't we create a mandate in Central Europe with the Czech, instead of creating a modern independent Czechoslovakia? So there is a structure. No. Mandate is something that you do not apply to Europeans. You apply mandates on other nations. So so definitely part of what plays a very significant role in Palestine is a clear understanding of Weizmann, for instance, that the British are very much attracted to the Zionists. The more they will show themselves as white, sophisticated civilization, force in the Middle East, the more they will gain. And if there is a huge impact that people like Weizmann will have on people like Copeland through these tours, is exactly this. he'll take him to the Ziff Institute of Science that is still today the Weizmann. So he plays it in this way. So this was part of the equation, and the last part of the equation, which is not contradictory, goes back to my comment about Jabotinsky. In many of the radical thinkers, so to speak, liberal radicals in Britain after World War I, they are thinking about giving more self-government to some groups or taking them more seriously. They will go back and refer time and again to their contribution to the war effort during World War I. So if the Indian forces prove that they're willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice and die for the empire in World War I, we should take them more seriously than other groups. This is not subtext. This is clearly a part of what they're producing in their report. So I don't have. I'm not the biggest expert on the Kurdish question, but I would. My off the cuff kind of a feeling would be is that these sort of factors are playing out in a different way. It's not Foreign Office, it's colonial office, it's not civilizational arguments and who contributed to the war effort.
I mean, what I in this British thought about partition. What I liked is kind of this ambiguity that was obviously there, or at least what I liked in your presentation about this was this ambiguity of partitioning in order to kind of keep together at the same time, to keep it a part of the empire. So in other words, to kind of keep an empire or a commonwealth maybe together, using a concept of territorialization of certain antagonisms. And I'm wondering indeed what the dimensions or the contexts are that the British thinkers were actually thinking within. Because European history of the 19th and 20th century is full of such cases and such stories. Well, just to talk about a story that is very kind of actually happening simultaneously to the story with Palestine and India is, for example, the creation of post-World War II Yugoslavia with its 6 republics that now represented the different ethnic entities. And this is something which actually, at least for a time being, guaranteed also the integrity of Yugoslavia. So kind of you have partitioning in order to keep together, partitioning in order to integrate, actually. With then the special case also of Bosnia-Herzegovina, thinking about the 1990s then, the 2 entities here. Or for example, also the Austrian-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. I'm wondering to which degree all these cases kind of played into the British political thought in this context. I mean, you've focused strongly on the example of Lausanne, for example, as kind of a historical background to this. But I'm wondering, wasn't there more? Also, just a final thought, you distinguished strictly between the European context, for example. You cannot put a mandate on somebody like the Czechs in Central Europe. You can do this in overseas territories.
This is an argument that was part of the conversation at the time. That
so the European historical context, how important was that?
So thank you. These are excellent questions. I mean, so part of the bigger argument here is that we need to go back and rethink about how federalism and federalist ideas, trickle down and operated. And actually, your question is, especially if we think about the Habsburg case and the 1867 constitution, is actually very important. It would be argued, at least one of the participants in our volume, the Gordon, that is talking about those among the Zionists that came from, especially the so-called Prague Circle, that developed, that were rejecting partition, not on the same ground as Jabotinsky, but they were thinking about, we all remember the 1920s binationalism, but by the 1940s, the group named Likud were thinking about federalist rearrangement of the space, and they were drawing comparisons both with their present, their contemporaneous examples, India, and they were saying, hey, these British don't understand what we Central European Jews know very well if we came from Habsburg lands. And they're drawing on the, so the British, so I will, so because it's a cake that has different layers, the British are, do have a tendency to be very insular. So they're thinking about methods of expanding their empire. The Lausanne case is one of the exceptions, that they're understanding that things are happening also out there, but they're understanding it both because the empire now is coming close to these areas after World War I, and also because the League in Geneva is telling them it's on your doorstep, and you have to remember it's a post-Bolshevik circumstances. So part of what they're thinking about is how to expand the liberal world order that was countering what a different alternative, rearrangement of states. That of course, Soviet Union officially was also a federal arrangement. So this is so part of what I'm zooming out from the specific case of partition. Part of what I'm trying to do, and this is I'm in a good company of many historians, is that while in at least when I was in high school, there was a very clear narrative about the 20th century. 1914 marks the end, right, the beginning of the age of extremes, as Hobsbawm called it. This is the end of multinational empires. This is a bygone story, and then we entered the age of nation state big time. And and if you don't follow the trend, it's like the three monkeys. Things are slightly more complicated, and part of what I'm trying to argue is that partition played a very fun, interesting double role here. Without partition, the S word, state, would not be a central concept of rearranging and thinking about these new spaces. True, I'm not denying it for a second, but the states they're thinking about are states in a lowercase s within the British Commonwealth nation. But thank you.
Please.
Yeah. Did any of these earlier efforts, especially the movement of the Greeks and the Turks, did those conversations or those treaties include specific compensation to the people moved? Did they talk about an equal number being moved or land? And the reason I ask is because as a precedent for now, Palestinians want compensation if they're not going to have the right to return. And I'm wondering if they draw that from any of these earlier partitions and movement of people, or if that was never discussed. Because I don't think that was a part of the partition of India and Pakistan. I don't think at least that the Muslims going into Pakistan from India were able to get compensation for their homes and businesses they left behind. I think they ran.
So I will thank you. I mean, I will distinguish for a second between the Greco-Turkish case and India and Pakistan. So and the India-Pakistan case is actually a very important precedent for the Israeli legal mechanisms of what would be seen today as legalized looting. And the Israeli legal mechanisms that allowed taking abandoned property and create a state of metropolis that will govern it, and this is one of the most thorny issues in the conflict, was modeled not on British emergency laws, and a wonderful legal historian by the name of Alexander Kedar, showed it very, in a very empirical way by going through the draft. You have in the earliest Israeli government discussions, they are thinking about what would be the legal mechanisms that would that are best applicable to our case, and they're taking the law from Pakistan, and they're explicitly saying, despite the fact they're Muslims, the circumstances are there. Now, I'm mentioning it because part of what happened in Pakistan and Israel and India is exactly that you did have this mechanism in which two states were created. So it was, and the scales of the partition in India are by far, bigger than the very thorny events of the 1948 war that the Israelis will call Atzmaut and the Palestinians will call Nakba. But what happened is that in the India and Pakistan you have two states. So you have mechanisms of exchange, and you have bureaucrats that are dealing with exactly this swap. You did not have two states created after 1948 war in Palestine. So you have a mechanism that has a vacuum at the other end, a legal mechanism. So this is, I'll be happy to send you to the relevant literature that does exactly this. How it applies to contemporary politics and advocacy and debates, I leave it to the political activists. I'm a historian trying to understand the mechanism. But the mechanism, the legal mechanism, was entirely drawn on the Pakistani.
But they didn't count people or square miles or monetary compensation. This many people, we give you that amount of money.
Who are they?
The people making these, agreeing to these exchanges in Lausanne before and after.
So Lausanne is not a partition. Lausanne is an expulsion of population that is ratified by the League of Nations. It's not a partition. Lausanne is an important step on the road towards thinking about partition in the 30s as a package deal that includes exchange. It's a component. Partition, as it's practiced, I can refer you to the literature. I mean, the things that you find in the partition of India and Pakistan are amazing. There's a wonderful dissertation in art history that was just submitted at UCLA about how they're going into the National Museum, the most important museum in the Raj in New Delhi, and are cutting, literally, art pieces into two, dividing them between the Pakistani and the Indians. This is remarkable. It's eerie, but this is the level of a bureaucratic thinking about how you turn an idea into a practice. I don't want to go into the details, the devastating, the tragic consequences of massive rapes and the genocidal crimes that were part of creation of these new countries. And I do want to remind us that this is one of the most volatile. These are two atomic. If there will be an atomic war, it might be on that border. So it's not exactly a great solution, so to speak. But this is, but to your question of whether they were thinking about, at the time in the 40s, about precedents, yes, definitely they were using analogies of this kind.
Yeah, I wanted to get a clarification about India and Pakistan. If I understood what you said, you suggested that British support for partition was part of an effort to sustain some kind of British imperial authority around the world.
In Palestine, okay.
Yeah. But when I think about the Britain's decision to leave India, the debates in the House of Commons juxtaposed Winston Churchill, who was opposed, because he viewed this as an attempt to get rid of the British Empire, and Clement Attlee in the Labour Party, who viewed this as a continuation of wartime anti-fascism and anti-imperial sentiment. That is, not to continue the empire, but to get rid of it. So that's one question. And the second is that you were criticizing some of what you referred to as British imperial historians for neglecting new scholarship on social and regional and oral histories. But you didn't speak about religious fanaticism at all, whether it was between Catholics and Protestants or Hindus and Muslims, which can't be blamed on the British. I wondered if you could address those local factors.
No, thank you. So to start with the first question, and I think that your first question is you put your finger exactly on one of the cardinal points here. That illuminates the striking difference between the way partitions were first imagined in a pre-World War II context and the radical change of the meaning of what it means to partition in the post-1945 context. So this is exactly why, as an intellectual historian, I'm used to the fact that the same word changes its meaning over time. So part of, if in a way, your question exactly, alludes to that element, that the British were reluctant to think about partition in India. I mean, they were thinking about partition in Palestine as a method of containment, and even maybe as a way to get rid of the sort of a Geneva in the League of Nations looking at them, because maybe you will cancel out the mandate and you no longer need to get awful reports from the Permanent Mandate Commission in Geneva telling you, no, you're not doing good things. You're taking them out of the equation. They were reluctant to use this method in the British Raj for various reasons, and the debates in those in the 1930s between Gandhi and the Indian Congress Party is about different modes of representation. He's calling for, as I've mentioned, at the Round Table Conference when Gandhi famously comes to London, and it's famous because of the photos. It was pouring rain and cold, and he went in his famous barefoot and to meet with the king, and of course disobeying the protocol, because so it was about performance of a different identity, but it was not about the way we would imagine anti-colonial revolt in a post-war context. By the 1940s, they're sticking in a different language, and also it has a lot to do with internal mechanisms. So about the Muslim and coming and using the two-state nations theory. They started to think about a different state. Now, as it comes to religious leadership in these in all these cases, where even to begin? If you look at the father of the Pakistani nation, Mr. Jinnah, he's more of a gentleman than a gentleman. He's, as I like to call it, four-part suit, sort of gentleman. He's more, he looks like the classic British gentleman, and he is a savvy politician that is maneuvering things. He doesn't speak Urdu. He's not coming from a clerical background, but he is the father of the Muslim nation. So part of it has to do not only with religious fanaticism as we think about it, it's also about the way in which local national leadership plays with these ideas. And Aisha Jalal has this wonderful book on Jinnah that presents a very convincing argument about how he pushed himself to come to think about partition. As someone that doesn't like to let the British off the hook, yes, it's the creation of the Muslim of the Mufti as an institution, of course, is a British legacy, as also the great power of the chief rabbinates. So in the mandatory consequences, much more power goes into the hands of clerics. Part of what you see, the dynamic you see in the 1920s and 30s coming from so-called secular leaders such as Jabotinsky, is that they are saying, oh, we need to rethink about how you subdivide the territory and take off, and rethink about it in territorial means, because what the British are doing in the early mandatory period is putting too much power in the hands of clerics. And this is actually coming from Jabotinsky, it's coming from Josiah Wedgwood, that was the author of the idea of turning Palestine into a seventh dominion. So they saw themselves as liberal, countering the fact that the religious power is rising and fueled through the colonial mechanisms of the mandate.
Given that Copeland lived long enough to see that his notion of partition leading to unity did not come to fruition, did he ever revisit his notion and look at the unintended consequences, the theory versus the reality?
Okay. Well, thank you for this question. I think that his last book was his maybe attempt to address it. So I think both Copeland himself and many of his disciples or so-called disciples, a lot of the first generation of British imperial historians writing after World War II, when they saw what we would call today the waves of decolonization and addressed the question of partition, had a clear narrative of the partition, which is I call it sort of the Solomonic trial narrative, that we had all the good intentions. It also cast the British as King Solomon, the wisest of all, but these uncivilized natives. So his references here that the Welsh are more chill, are not warm-blooded as these crazy Pakistani, allude to this to a great degree. So I would take this with a grain of salt. But I think that part of what is interesting about these thinkers is that when they're thinking about the global post-World War II global order, so many of them believe that a good United Nations is actually an extension of the way the British thought about their empire. What is the United Nations if not this league in which, and in a sense, and this is not the argument of this project, but I will try to develop this in greater detail in my next book. So part of the consequences of post-World War II is that the political language pretty much comes and says, if you want to have a ticket to enter the club, you have to call yourself a nation state. So we tend to read Zionist history in a linear way, as if from Herzl leaning on the balcony in Basel in 1897, we were all thinking nation state. And I beg to differ. And actually, there's no clear blueprint there. There's a lot of contingency and responding to changing circumstances. And the critical post-war years are years in which the Zionists are playing in a international theater in which they have some leverage, but also a lot of constraints. And in a way, given the circumstances of the war, given the fact that so many of the prophecies that you will find before the war are irrelevant once you have demographic prophecies about the future of Palestine that assume that there's European Jews from Central Europe that will come in mass, and they're no longer there. So a lot of the demographic prophecies are irrelevant in a post-Holocaust consequence. The Zionists are, quote unquote, pushed to say, okay, so the name of the game is nation state. We need to declare ourselves a nation state. You have to remember that the first draft of the Israeli Declaration of Independence that was thrown to the garbage was still thinking about some sort of a dominion status.
I'd like to ask one question, and then we'll adjourn upstairs to floors for the Hanukkah party. In response to Jeffrey's question about religion, I would see these partitions as mostly using religion as a ethnic group, not really fanaticism. One of the weird things about the Turkish Greek expulsions was that a ultra-secular Turkish leader used Islam as the criteria for who was Turkish and Christian for who was Greek, not a language. And the same thing, Ali Jinnah was, as you say, ultra-secular. He would have been appalled at what Pakistan had turned into. And the same thing, I think, on both sides, especially the Jewish side, in 48, that religion, the most right-wing people then were also ultra-secular. So I don't see religion as having much of a religious fanaticism, as having much of a role at that time.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's again one of the questions that I'm pushed to the Shimon Peres yes and no. Absolutely, that you see a very similar and sometimes surprising how much similar is the trajectory. If you put side by side, I wrote in a different article, the history of the Israeli Labor government and the Indian Congress Party. It's amazing to see how similar the trajectories are. It's not only, especially if you see both the pre-independence and the post-independence trajectory, even the elections they're losing are almost at the same dates. So you have a state, the strong party that had part of its power that creates it, its hegemonic power is the fact that it was able to persuade people that it brought independence, and often it's not run by Congress. Sometimes it even surprises people to what extent it seems as anti-clerical. The part of what is tricky here, if you look at Pakistan and Israel, is the way in which both states define themselves through so the state is called Jewish, and it's an open question how you define this Jewishness. And my colleague Faisal Devji, the reader of Indian history at Oxford, has a brilliant, very thought-provoking book about the history of Pakistan that is called Muslim Zion, and he shows how the fathers of the Pakistani nation are thinking about Zionism as a precedent, but they're thinking about it as a precedent in a religious term, and that the only if you take out Islam from Pakistan, it will collapse, because it has no crux to it. So, but I will still agree with your earlier comment that part of what you see here is the way in which religious language is being nationalized as part of the process.
So please join me in thanking Arie. Join us to